Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold. Where did it come from and where did it go?
And I am back from Tennessee, whatever that state's known for. Had a great time. The debate with Destiny, I think, went well, but you guys will be the judge. While you're here, please make sure you hit the like button. Leave a comment down below. Argue about what we argued about, and tell me where I screwed up. Because I know I left out a bunch of information that I should have included. But it's my first time doing a live debate. What can you do? If you guys want to be able to text me, you just have to get the Converso app. The phone number for me is 555-175-8394. Again, that's the Converso app. It's on Apple or Google Play stores. You can download it. It doesn't cost you anything. 555-175-8394. Legitimately, go straight to my phone. You can text me. I think it's the best private messaging app that's out there. And I am a true believer at this point. And I think that the rollout of additional features that is coming this week, you're not going to want to miss it. And right now, it already has a list of features that I don't think any other messaging app can compete with. And that includes end-to-end encryption. It doesn't store your user data, your messages themselves. It's phenomenally private. And if you are privy to the either deep state or big tech spying apparatus that exists, well, then you need a tool that allows you to still have a little bit of privacy in this world. And that, my dear friends, is Converso. Converso. Just go search for it in any app store and you'll be able to find it. And then text me at 555-175-8394. Enjoy my debate with Destiny.
Without any more delay, Clint, Destiny.
Thank you. You like the first open?
Do what?
You want the first open or you want me to go?
I can go if you want.
Okay.
So my position is pretty simple. I think there are 5 important reasons why it's imperative for the United States to support Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russian conflict. I think the first thing is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, initially when they seized Crimea, was obviously and completely unjustified, and who better to stand against a Russian unjustified invasion than the United States with the collaboration of NATO and Russia. Second reason is because I think a peaceful and stable Europe is important to the entire world, especially to the United States. They're important geopolitical allies and they're important trading partners. For the third point, in '94, we signed 3 different agreements called the Budapest Memorandum that had 3 countries, one of them being Ukraine, agreeing to give up all of their nuclear arsenal back to Russia in exchange for their territorial sovereignty being respected. It is not currently being respected, so I think that we should enforce that treaty. Number 4, I think that if we allow Russia to invade Ukraine, to hold on to Crimea, or to conquer even more territory, we're basically sending a message to the rest of the world that unless you're either part of NATO, part of a Russia-China alliance, or somebody that's acquiring nuclear weapons on your own, you're not safe. So I think that for the purposes of preventing nuclear proliferation, it's probably important to prevent other countries from thinking that they're going to be invaded and conquered if they don't have nuclear weapons of their own. And then the final reason is because I think that a victory for Russia here will both embolden Russia and China in future territorial conquest. So I think it's an important thing to shut down that idea right now and to show them that the rest of the world will stand against those types of activities that infringe on the territorial sovereignty of other countries.
I'm 40 years old. I'm a man, I'm 40. I don't know if you've seen that press conference, it's hilarious. In my entire life, I have witnessed U.S. global hegemony. It hasn't gone so hot. The national debt has gone from about $1 trillion when I was born to $32 trillion today. Not even $1 trillion when I was born, but I am kind of bold now. I'm extremely concerned about the trajectory. I think that ultimately we're going to get caught up, and I know we're going to do it anyways. We're going to get caught up in the minutia of the relationship between Russia, Ukraine, NATO, America, Russia, all of the intervening situations that led to this war. But at the end of the day, it is my belief, and a fervent one, that the United States of America has lost its moral authority. It does not have the right to be dictating geopolitics on a global scale. So that'll be the umbrella argument. I think that the secondary argument will be that this war was quite clearly provoked. Now, not justified, he's not justified in the invasion, but I think that it's a very unfair argument to make that the US government wasn't fomenting and pushing for there to be conflict between both Ukraine and Russia, as well as many, many other nations, which we will also get into. So yeah, I'll keep it tight. Ultimately, I think that this is the gravest threat to humanity that exists on the planet today, and this is why I was so thrilled to have this conversation with Destiny, because I think it's a very important one to be having, and I appreciate your guys' time in coming out. Thank you.
Well, I guess we can start at the beginning. A claim that I hear oftentimes put forth is that this war was provoked somehow by the West or the United States. How do you get that idea? Where does that come from?
Well, it comes from quite a few things. First off, there was, and I know it's not in contract, but there was a litany of promises made after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the USSR that there would be no expansion of NATO, and particularly there would be no expansion of military equipment into any Eastern NATO territories. That was promised once again in '97 by Bill Clinton. It was immediately broken, and also by George Bush and every president that followed after that. So from an American perspective, which I grant that you take, it can be argued that these are all voluntary military alliances, but in my estimation, what's actually occurring is because the US was the dominant military power at that time, you had these other nations that were caught in between the two largest powers, and they're choosing between the two big dogs. They're basically being coerced into these decisions. There's also obviously a litany of color revolutions that have been funded by our State Department, the National Endowment for Democracy.
Yeah, can we do these one at a time? So
Yes.
So the first thing that we said, I don't buy NATO expansion.
Apologies, by the way.
What?
Apologies, by the way, for rattling off.
Oh, no, you're good, you're good. It's just easier to go one at a time. I don't buy the NATO expansion argument for Russia invasion into Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine hyper-specifically in response to Euromaidan. They did not invade when NATO was opening up membership even to bordering countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. Even when the Baltics joined, Russia didn't, rattle any sabers. NATO has been expanding. I don't believe there's ever been a formal promise. There might have been talks, but there's never been a formal diplomatic arrangement saying nobody would join NATO. And the idea that countries felt pressured to join NATO because of some force from the West, and not because of the horrible relationships that they had under the Soviet Union, I think is not a fair characterization. So I just don't buy the NATO expansion thing. I think to show that NATO expansion was the cause of the invasion to Ukraine, we have to see NATO we have to see Russia ever responding negatively or with invasion to any NATO expansion. And the fact is they haven't. And we have a very clear reason for why they invaded Crimea, and it was in response to Euromaidan.
Well, I think it was particularly after Euromaidan because is it Yanukovych?
Yeah, Yanukovych fled the country.
They tore up the lease that they had on Sevastopol, which being their only year-round warm water naval port, which they had a lease on from the time of Ukraine's independence up until 2014, that was a bridge too far for them. And I think that if you were to put it in American terms, now granted you can't really do it because America is filled with warm water ports, but it would be like San Diego no longer being on offer to our Navy. And I think that, while it may not be justified, certainly America would have done the same thing in taking access to that port, particularly given their vantage point and their view that it had been a coup, as, who was it? George Friedman of Stratford referred to it as the most obvious coup in world history. He's not exactly a peacenik himself. So do you grant that it was at least a State Department-backed coup in 2014, or do you not?
No, there's no evidence whatsoever that it was a State Department-backed coup. There had been plenty of protest throughout the entire Euromaidan for issues in Ukraine. Yanukovych became immensely unpopular when he decided not to join any European Union trade agreement, but instead wanted to join the trade embargo, the tariff customs union, essentially, that Russia was pushing upon them. And aside from one leaked phone call that gets talked over and over again by Nuland and the other lady, People try to say that that's evidence that we were supporting through monetary support or something, some coup or whatever in Ukraine, but there's never been any valid evidence ever put forward from that. And then also as a minor thing, Sevastopol is not the only warm water port that Russia has. They also have access to the port of Tartus in Syria, which is another warm water port they have access to. But
Okay. Well, I find it's almost, it stretches credulity for me to believe that you don't think it's odd that Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt were having that conversation in the 2
what's
weeks.
odd about expressing preference for leadership in an unstable country?
Well, it's 6,000 miles away from us.
Okay, but it's part of Europe. I mean, regardless, we have ambassadors to countries all over the world, even farther away than Ukraine. I don't think there's anything odd about ambassadors or diplomats expressing interest in a type of leader they might prefer in another country. And also, expressing interest is not, we're going to go ahead and back a coup. There's just never been any evidence of that whatsoever. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, when you pair that with the amount of funding that's also going into the National Endowment for Democracy, you have, on record, you have, what's his name? Good God. You guys know it. The guy who runs all the geopolitics stuff. How am I blanking? What's that? No. Soros, thank you. Goodness gracious. You have Soros who is responsible for, obviously funding much of that, but also then the 3 news stations, which he's bragging about, essentially, modifying the ground for this revolution. You have Victoria Nuland, who's been over there for years. You really don't think that you think she's just there to watch? Is that your honest position?
I reject the notion that we can look at things that are like kind of weird and say that was definitely a foreign-funded revolution. I think there has to be at least one shred of evidence. I don't think a leaked phone call and NGOs or international organizations that are funded for democracy make a coup. It's also, I don't like that framing because it also removes agency from the Ukrainians. Ukraine, prior to 2014, was one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
Correct.
The idea that there's going to be, protests here, the idea that there's going to be a revolution or an ousting of Yanukovych, especially after the Baku and the firing and the protests and everything, and after shutting down their Congress that had voted to join the EU, or the EU's trade agreement, the idea that there would have been a revolution after that that needed to be funded by the United States just doesn't make any sense. Again, we can kind of point to it, but I've never seen any evidence for it ever, and there's such a clear line of reasoning. Ukraine was super corrupt, Yanukovych was perceived as betraying the will of the people, protests happened, protesters got killed, he fled the country after, it's just such a clear line, and there's no evidence for the theory that the United States backed in one way or another any kind of coup, so.
Well, certainly the Russians and the Russian people believe it, and you also had, Strat 4, you've had many American analysts that consider it to have been a coup. So I don't think that it's, whole cloth fiction to assume that there might be some credence to Putin's concerns. You also have the fact that he's consistently warning, particularly in 2007 and 8 with George Bush, stating that you cannot continue with this and that NATO is ultimately the reddest of red lines. It's not just Putin's position, but also the Russian people. They state that there's essentially no one living in Russia that feels comfortable with Ukraine being added to NATO. And my question for you would be, do you find that to be a worthwhile concern for them, that they would have an alliance on their border with the greatest nuclear power on Earth? And would that, in the inverse, be an acceptable practice for America if Mexico or Canada were to do the same?
It's hard to imagine Mexico or Canada doing it because of the geographic separation, and also because we don't have the relationship with Mexico or Canada that the former Soviet Union did with many of their member states or the territories or members of the Warsaw Pact. There are good reasons why people that were part of the former Soviet Union don't want anything to do with Russia. And when you look at Russia's behavior, it could be in countries like Georgia, where they marched in, declared some independent territory, sent peacekeepers, broke it off, essentially the same thing they've done in Ukraine. When you look at what they've done in places like Moldova, when you look at how ruthless their support is in places like Syria, it's not really surprising that those countries would want to join NATO, especially when we're kind of having this rule in the world now where it's like, well, if you're not part of NATO and if you don't have nukes, you can basically get invaded and there's nothing anybody can do about it. I fully reject, also there's a lot of this realist analysis. I don't know if it's Mearsheimer who's responsible for all this or what, but this idea that well, Russia is scared of these guys, therefore all of these territories forfeit all of their autonomy. Why in the, and were you allowed to cuss here?
Sure.
Okay, why the fuck does Russia get to decide what people on their borders are allowed to do in terms of joining military alliance? If NATO was an aggressive alliance that had been like invading Russia or was representing some sort of militaristic threat to Russia, maybe I could understand, but we don't invade Russia. We have no plans to invade Russia. We're not going to invade Russia. We've never invaded Russia. The idea that they're actually threatened by that, when we already have member states like the Baltics and now Finland that are bordering Russia, that are part of NATO, is, again, I don't buy it. I don't think it's a real concern. I don't believe it. I think they just want to exert like authoritarian control over their neighbors like they do with Belarus.
I mean, they're on record, Victoria Nuland once again is on record that they are arming and supporting Ukraine in strikes within Russia. Is that not, in effect, proxy war invasion?
Wait, inside Russia?
Correct.
I don't believe that.
You don't believe that they're striking inside Russia? There has been reports over the past few months.
There might be, like, I think there was one, well, let's see, there was one missile, I think, that they accused, Zelensky accused Russia of firing into some city, but I think they fired an accident, but no, I don't
Well,
believe
that was into Poland, but there's also, drones that they've equipped them with. I mean, it's
Well,
just...
this is a pretty big claim. If we're doing attacks inside Russia, that's a big claim. I don't believe that is happening right now. No, I haven't heard that. I feel like I feel like that was a thing, it would be international news and everybody would be talking about it.
I'll have to get you a source after, but I've read it a few times. Anybody else heard that, or am I making it up? A few of you? Okay. So yeah, I think that there's an interesting trend line. So do you reject the idea that the color revolutions that ripped across, Europe and the Middle East over the 2000 period was, I mean, it was certainly funded by the State Department to some extent, but you're saying that it was primarily organic, so it's okay that the State Department is doing so?
I mean, Tunisia was organic. I don't know if that's relevant. I don't know if I want to bridge out to like the entire like Arab Spring and everything. I think I'd prefer to just focus on Ukraine. Like I said, I don't see any evidence for prior to the Ukrainian conflict for the United States supporting it militarily or financially or anything.
I'm attempting to draw the trend line to kind of prove out the case that the revolution, that the Maidan was in fact a State Department-backed coup. You have the color revolutions. 2000 is Yugoslavia, it's the bulldozer revolution. 03, Georgia, which is the Rose Revolution that happens twice. Then the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which puts Yushchenko in. Kyrgyzstan with the Tulip Revolution. Lebanon and the Cedar Revolution. This is 0505. 06 is Belarus and the Jeans Revolution. 09 is Moldova in gray. 09, Iran in green. And then there's a whole bunch more that rip through the Middle East. Well, certainly it requires a ripe population for any of this to happen. I am not trying to take away all sovereignty and all human autonomy in rising up against your government. In fact, I wish we would do that a whole lot more than we do. But I think that the reality is if you have so many that are hitting consecutively year after year, it strains credulity, once again, to just believe that these are all organic happenings entirely, particularly when oftentimes they benefit U.S. interests.
Sure, then find me evidence of it. If there's any evidence of it whatsoever, I'd be compelled to pay attention to it. But pointing out a bunch of revolutions that have happened and some that the U.S. may or may not have backed is not compelling evidence to say that the Ukrainian revolution was due to U.S. involvement.
Okay. I'd like to understand a little bit why you think this is worth risking World War III, much less nuclear holocaust.
I don't think we're at much of a risk for World War III or nuclear holocaust, although I would say that if we were at risk, the risk would be allowing Russia to dominate, take over territory from Ukraine uncontested, and kind of rewrite the new rules of Europe and Asia, saying that it's once again okay for superpowers to take over and steal sovereign territory from countries if they don't have nuclear weapons to defend themselves. I think that a world where we allow Russia to continue is a world where Russia invades Georgia again, is a world where Russia looks to other non-aligned European countries possibly to meddle in. It's a world where China feels compelled to take over Taiwan with no reaction. Like, I don't think I think that the world that exists where Russia is allowed to behave in this way is probably a world that's more likely to end up in a nuclear holocaust than a world where we say, hey, you can't invade countries and take their shit. We don't do that anymore.
It strikes me as preposterous, honestly, that America can be dictating that is a bridge too far. I mean, since 1991, you have the Iraq War, you have Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq again, Pakistan, Somalia, Kenya, Libya, Iraq again, Yemen, and Syria.
And how many of those wars did we take territory?
Is that a really huge distinction
pretty huge
in your
part,
mind?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that
Also, in some of these wars, we're getting like we're getting massive support multilaterally, even for things that weren't that popular, like even for things like Libya that was arguably not too good afterwards. Gaddafi was so unpopular, even China abstained from voting against us for taking actions there. There's a difference between building a coalition and taking a lot of countries and going and doing a thing versus Russia unilaterally just invading a place to steal territory.
What about America's unilateral support for Kosovo and breaking it off? I mean, that was in direct opposition. That was actually what, in my estimation, radicalized not just the Russian people, but Putin ultimately realizing that NATO is no longer a defensive alliance. It's, if you don't get UN Security Council authorization to do that, is that not also an illegal war which changes the borders of another nation, particularly one that's on the border of Russia?
Sure, so NATO doesn't necessarily need UN authorization because it's NATO, it's a separate military alliance. But regardless, I'm not going to sit here and defend every single foreign policy decision the United States has made even in the last 30 years, even since '91. I think there are obvious and clear mistakes that the United States has made. But I don't think that that justifies Russia invading and stealing territory from other countries. I find it a bit strange that the United States, which is inarguably the most influential country in the world, both militarily, economically, and thirdly, I guess, culturally, that we have to put every single mistake that we make under a magnifying glass and then say, well, look, Russia's really worried about the United States because we've made foreign policy blunders in the past, while Russia is plutonium poisoning journalists and locking up political adversaries. I don't think it's a fair comparison. I think that we can stand for Ukraine. We can say we do have a moral authority to intervene here, while also recognizing that the U.S. foreign policy hasn't been perfect. We've made mistakes as well.
I mean, Julian Assange is in prison, so to say that we respect journalism any better than the Russians is, I mean, any better?
Do you think that's true?
Yes.
Do you think the United States treats journalists in a similar manner as Russia does? Like, let's say on a scale
Similar,
from 1
yes.
to 10, let's say that I put Russia on an 8 for how bad they treat journalists. Where would you put the United States?
I'm sorry, you put them on a what?
Let's say on a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 is the worst treatment. Let's say that I put Russia on an 8 for how they treat journalists. Where would you put the United States on that scale?
Well, it's an interesting grading scale because there's so few decent journalists that are actually trying to blow the whistle on anything true in this fucking country. But I would say that it's probably on good journalists, ones that are actually telling secrets that they're not supposed to. I'd say it's a 6. I mean, you have really bad treatment of journalists in this country if they actually, whistleblowers are prosecuted, and it's a bipartisan affair. Obama, Trump, Bush, there's been whistleblower prosecutions consistently over the past 20 years. So, I mean, granted, that's not necessarily journalists, but it is the avenue by which you get information to journalists. So it is criminalizing leaks and free speech.
Sure. So again, and it's this weird binary thing is very strange to me. I would agree that the United States hasn't been perfect with the way that they treat whistleblowers. There are definitely problems there. But to say that because we have had some questionable behavior or some abhorrent behavior in regards to some journalists, that we're on the same level as Russia, who will literally kill journalists in other countries, like blatantly too, using things like plutonium poisoning so the entire world can see what they're doing. I think that if you talk to any journalist that does reporting in the United States or is involved in reporting on foreign affairs, they will never tell you that, yeah, in Russia and the United States, they're pretty similar in terms of how bad they treat journalists. That's just not true at all.
And I think if you were to talk most people across the globe and were to compare the imperialist desires of Russia versus America over the past 30 years, people would laugh if you were to say that Russia is even comparable to America in its imperialist desires. Now, granted, they don't keep the landmass, but I do have some examples for you. In borders that have been altered over the past 20 years, you have Kosovo from Serbia, that was in the late 90s. You also have Western Sahara to Morocco, that was under Trump, and you have South Sudan from Sudan to Czech China. You also have the West Bank to Israel, which is, once again, a nuclear power, which is bullying a non-nuclear one. There's a litany of examples where America does not respect people's borders. They also don't care about unilateral decision-making when it comes to invasions. I'll grant you, we do treat our journalists slightly better. I just don't think that if we're going to make that comparison and have that discussion, then I would like for you to acknowledge that we have been a far more dangerous entity on the global scale when it comes to intervention and militarism.
If we're so much more dangerous, then why did every former Soviet Union state run to NATO to join us as soon as possible?
Because they were leaving the USSR.
Yeah, but why not go back to, why not stay non-aligned? Why not go to Russia later on once they've gotten their shit figured out post-91? Why would you join NATO if it's such a horrible, imperialistic, disgusting entity that's going to rope you into crazy things?
Because you're then under the auspices of the greatest bully in my lifetime. Wouldn't you rather be, if you're a small kid on the block, wouldn't you rather have the biggest bully defending you?
I mean, arguably, but that's just another justification for why you should be allowed to join the United States then. Is it not? Also, I don't know if you could say that the United States is the biggest bully compared to, like, what has the United States done unilaterally, like in comparison to Russia when it comes to like China or Mexico, right? In terms of our neighbors.
Oh, in terms of our direct neighbors? I mean, I think that we apply soft power more often, but we also apply sanctions quite viciously. I think this is an important side note that we should discuss, but there is this belief, and I've heard some of your prior discussions where you make it sound as if this is to the benefit of the American people. I say quite to the contrary. I believe that we are jeopardizing and imminently sacrificing the dollar reserve status and now languishing under pretty severe inflation, the worst in my lifetime. I don't think that this all transpires if it were not for the debts and deficits and record spending that has been part and parcel of our militarism for the past 20 years, most starkly. It's devastating, and not to mention the blowback. We can get into all of the other consequences that come from our military adventurism, whether it be supporting bin Laden in the 1980s and then having that backfire in our faces in a major way. The amount of civil liberties that we've sacrificed under the war on terror. I mean, there are huge prices that are paid by the American people because we have supported this kind of neoconservative view that we are the policemen of the world. It has not worked out well for us, nor has it worked out for the rest of the world, aside from avoiding World War III, which we are on the precipice of. So any of the benefits that have come from it, I think that they diminish or they pale in comparison to the threats that we face today.
I don't know how we can say it hasn't benefited us. We won the Cold War. I mean, America doesn't have a
Correct.
perfect track record, but we are the world hegemony. We do
And we
lead
gave it
the
up for
world.
nothing.
We are the ones that dictate the terms of how every other superpower acts. I don't understand how we can say the United States lost or is doing poorly or isn't benefiting by the assurances that we have of trade routes backed by the U.S. military, by the strength of our economy and the ability to trade with other countries.
Brother, I agree with you. We have benefited tremendously from winning the Cold War. The problem is that instead of realizing the competitive advantage we had and capitalizing on that peaceful period, we turned towards militarism that was highly avoidable. And in the process, we sacrificed not just our civil liberties, but also the dollar's dominant position on the global scale. You now have Saudi Arabia and Iran that are negotiating peace at the behest of China. You have France, which is selling liquefied natural gas in other currencies outside of the US dollar for the first time. This is in direct conflict with American demands and interests. They're doing so because they don't agree. France and Germany have been on the other side of this. They did not want to have this fight between Ukraine and Russia, and they realized that, ultimately I think that NATO is in grave jeopardy of ending. Now, from my vantage point, that's a good thing. From your vantage point, that's a terrible thing. So I think that there is huge consequences and prices that are being paid for benefits that are largely imaginary. From 1991, from that position of global dominance, undisputed global hegemon, best economy, best military, highly educated people, relative cultural cohesion, we could have been a dominant force for the next 100 years, and we squandered it because the fucking Project for a New American Century lunatics got into a place of power, and by some sick joke, now the left is also espousing the same ideology, and I don't know how this has happened, but it is a huge price, and it's ultimately to my detriment, but also to our children if we expect to have any. I mean, this is a huge threat that we're facing, and it was all avoidable.
I mean, we still have the largest military. We still have some of the best educational institutions in the world. We still have the largest economy. So I don't know why you're pretending like all of that is gone because we're unhappy about a war in Ukraine. We can say that France and Germany initially had some misgivings or some opposition to getting involved in the conflict of Ukraine, but ultimately we were able to unite these countries, and we all are helping Ukraine. The idea that NATO is in a weaker spot now than it was before, I think is ridiculous. I think that prior to Russia invading, I think NATO was in kind of an iffy spot because nobody knew what the point of the alliance was. People thought that NATO was initially just a thing to be against the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union falls in '91, then we kind of run around the world and we do kind of weird things as part of like NATO, a NATO power, but now with Russia invading, now the entire world is like, well, hold on, maybe there is a point to NATO. That's why we've got Finland, who also shares a border with Russia, who is now a member of NATO. That's why we've got Sweden, I think, is now on a membership ascension plan, or membership action plan.
You're listing all the reasons I believe that World War III is a graver threat than it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, but all of this is being instigated by Russia invading Ukraine. I can't understand the insane mental gymnastics we have to go through to look at Russia invading Ukraine in 2014, and then Russia invading Ukraine again in 2022 and then going like, man, the United States sure is fucking with world peace. That's just an insane proposition to me.
I don't think...
I think that Russia is invading for no good reason, and even the reasons, even if I grant all of it, that like NATO makes them feel scared. Why? Because they can't move to countries like Georgia or Moldova or Ukraine and fuck with them anymore? Or why? Because they're worried that they can't, I guess, like meddle with their neighbors in other ways, or they can't be assassinating people on their borders. The idea that NATO would make Russia scared when we haven't used NATO to attack Russia ever is an absurd proposition to me. Countries should be allowed to join if they want to.
It's a very simple explanation as to why they would be scared. It's the same reason that we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you have nations that are allied with the greatest nuclear powers on the planet, and you aren't able to inspect what's happening on that ground, you can have intermediate nuclear missiles that can reach Moscow within minutes. That completely throws out of whack the balance of mutually assured destruction. I don't understand why you wouldn't take their concerns seriously, sincerely.
The nuclear mutually assured destruction is still insured. MAD is still very much a thing. The nuclear triad still very much exists. There are plenty of nuclear subs out and about.
Can I explain?
Sure.
Yeah, the reason that mutually assured destruction actually works is because there's enough lead time that we don't have to make decisions in a microsecond. If you're now stationing nuclear weapons, which because of a litany of treaties, I can read off the list of treaties that were established by U.S. presidents that were then torn up by their predecessors repeatedly. There's no longer any faith in the U.S. as a good actor when it comes to negotiating to try and avoid these types of Cold War attitudes that could lead to a grave mistake. I mean this in all sincerity, just to set aside the debate for a second. I think that we are facing by far, the greatest threat of nuclear war in my lifetime, arguably in human history, in terms of, setting aside Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, when there's two parties that actually have enormous nuclear arsenals, and there is this kind of just banal acceptance that, like, we're going to risk whatever it takes up until the point of all life on Earth ending to decide which corrupt government gets to rule over the Donbass region and Crimea. For the life of me, I can't understand the human calculus.
For the life of me, I can't understand how you would allow the saber rattling of Russia, who still, by the way, is very much not in a position to nuke anybody. It's not what their intentions are. They're very clearly communicating movement of their arms throughout the world. They're very clearly communicating when they're moving some nuclear weapons to Belarus, when they're moving things around. Russia is adhering to every part of their doctrine that demonstrates that they have no intention right now of using nuclear weapons. The entire world strategically knows that, but for PR, every time Putin says we're moving a nuclear warhead somewhere, everybody around the world goes, oh my God, we're about to enter nuclear winter. This idea that it's unprecedented that the United States would be supporting just through intelligence and military supplies Ukraine, and that's going to lead to nuclear winter. When we had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, and in some of these places we actually had U.S. troops shooting at Russian troops or Soviet Union troops. I agree that nuclear war is something we should definitely think about, but I don't think that you should use the auspice of nuclear war as a reason for why Russia is allowed to infinitely belliger people on their borders. It's just an insane proposition. And I don't think France or Germany or any of the European country would feel good about the idea that Ukraine would be turned into a puppet state like Belarus just because Putin can saber rattle nuclear weapons when it's never been the case that people have taken those threats seriously. And I don't think he has any intentions to use them now.
Well, I certainly hope you're right. I personally think that if his back is against the wall, which as of 6 months ago, it looked as if it was much more against the wall than it does today. It looks as if he's taken quite a significant portion of the east, the vast majority of the landmass east of the Dnieper River. I do believe, though, that for him, from his vantage point, Crimea is existential. And I'm not sure that the Ukrainians can ever get it back. So since we only have 2 minutes left, I'd like to ask you, granted, neither of us have the capacity to negotiate a peace here, but I would certainly like to see cooler heads prevail and let this de-escalate as opposed to, adding every other bordering nation into NATO. Not like there's many left, as we've added 20 over the past 20 years, but is there a compromise to be had? Or I've heard your position in the past that you'll accept nothing less than full 1992 borders back to Ukraine. Is that still your position? Or?
Ukraine should be restored to their original territorial sovereignty. If Russia wants to rent Sevastopol or whatever else out, if they've got a lease there for that, then fine, they can rent that base. But Ukraine should accept nothing less than the restoration of their borders that the entire world, the former Soviet Union, Russia, agreed upon in 1991.
And if they're not willing to accept that, even though it does appear that they're losing the war, at least at present, are you prepared to have NATO intervene on their behalf?
NATO will never, like Article 5, intervene in Ukraine because Ukraine is not a member state. So that should never happen. And I don't believe that NATO would ever trigger an Article 5 intervention against Russia troops. So I don't think I would support that.
Okay, why?
The idea of having U.S. or NATO troops shooting at Russian troops does put us on a very scary escalatory path towards some sort of limited nuclear warfare. So that's why right now I support the engagement in terms of sending intelligence, in terms of sending military aid, in terms of other countries working alongside Ukraine. But I don't think like U.S. troops or planes in Ukraine is a good idea, or NATO troops in Ukraine is a good idea.
I think we're out on time, so I would imagine.
Guys, appreciate you, and also appreciate the fact you did this in a nice, respectful manner. You don't always see that. Thank you, both of you guys, for going at this. Highly commendable. I know I saw a lot of whispering, moaning, and folks with questions. We wanted to make sure we had enough time, so I'm going to Phil Donahue this thing. I see Keith Knight has his hand raised.
In 2015, the people in the Donbass of Donetsk and Luhansk voted for independence from the newly installed regime, and for 7 years the Ukrainian government murdered those civilians, up to 14,000. Is that not a violation equivalent of what Russia has done in Ukraine? Shouldn't their sovereignty be respected?
Nope. I super don't care about any type of polling or voting done once Russia controls territory. They've already shown what they're willing to do in Crimea in terms of controlling those votes, and I would never, ever, ever trust any poll ever ran or any voting ran in a Russian-controlled breakaway state. Never.
If you could share the microphone, we only got two, sorry.
Oh, I didn't know those were both, sorry.
I'm an anarchist. I think that the entire apparatus of the state is a fiction. So if you vote to leave, you should be allowed to. Now, I will actually agree with him that if it's done under coercive, circumstances, it should be in doubt as to the sincerity of that, referendum. It had been independently confirmed in Crimea that it was a supermajority that actually did want to leave, but he will also argue quite validly that Russia had already taken it. So can that be looked at legitimately? It's a very messy situation. I personally think that there is a significant portion of eastern Ukraine, particularly after the 8 years of bombing, that would prefer, quite rationally, to be part of Russia as opposed to Ukraine, and I think that they are sincere in those wishes. So it's complicated, though, because there's also people in the East that I'm sure don't want to leave. So what do you do? It's the shitty aspects of democracy, right?
Next question.
Destiny, you're saying you would be concerned if there were U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. Didn't we learn recently from the latest leaks from that Discord guy from the military that there were, in fact, boots on the ground in Ukraine?
My understanding is there might be some like special forces or somebody like involved in training or whatever, but that's a far cry from. I'm talking about like a full military presence in like taking part in active combat operations in Ukraine. My understanding is that hasn't happened yet. I know there was an Intercept article that was released, I think a few months ago, that was claiming otherwise, but I've never read anything else confirming or coordinating or corroborating with that article. But I mean, if there was, I think that that's a scary proposition because obviously things can escalate pretty quickly from there.
I see the gentleman in the front here. Thank you guys for keeping concise questions.
First, just one quick comment. You said you didn't understand why the Russian people would be scared of all this stuff. I'm not justifying their fear or the invasion or anything, but just you might want to look into some of the history of Russia. They've been invaded by the Mongols, the Germans, the French. They have been historically invaded by brutal armies. That's part of the reason the Russian people are so scared. But separately from that, when you say things like we should not allow a country like Russia to go around throwing their weight around, that implies that we, whatever we are, presumably the United States government, I guess, is God. It's the moral authority over the earth. Now, I'm guessing you don't actually believe in God, but that if you don't believe in God, there's no such thing as a objective moral standard like Russia can't invade their neighbors. So can you talk about your philosophy of moral authority, where it comes from, and specifically how the United States government has moral authority?
I mean, you can get there in a few ways. You can get there ethically through, who's an invader, who's a defender. You can get there, I guess, in terms of like construction of the world, in terms of like who do most countries trust. I guess, like broadly speaking, I'll say in the simplest of terms, somebody is going to make decisions about the state of security in the world or the state of security in Europe. Somebody's going to. If we decide that the United States is going to abstain from that decision-making apparatus, then it'll be Russia or it'll be China. So insofar as I'm a US citizen, and insofar as I believe, despite what some people think, I do think that the United States does hold itself to a higher standard and does conduct itself better than Russia. Now that doesn't mean they conduct themselves perfectly. That I would much rather the United States be making those decisions about security in other countries than Russia. And more importantly, it seems that Ukraine would rather the United States be making those decisions rather than Russia. So, I mean, insofar as it seems like the will of the general Ukrainian people and the leadership structure in Ukraine prefers the US making those decisions, the general status of Europe seems to agree with the United States making those decisions. Post-91, Europe has been a relatively peaceful place compared to what it was like post-World War II during the Cold War. It just seems to be the case that the United States and Europe working together to ensure the security status in Europe, it seems to have been working out pretty good so far, and I think that's the status quo that I would continue to support.
Next question.
Can I answer that real quick? Absolutely. I don't think we have the moral authority. I personally, I don't think that it's incumbent upon the American people to fund all of this bloodshed. I also think that there's a bloody enough and a legal and a moral enough track record that we should be highly skeptical of any claims from the military-industrial complex or our media moving forward. And I am deeply skeptical of the claims that they're making when it comes to Russia. And I honestly don't understand why more people aren't, particularly after the COVID hysteria and what we just went through with being lied to for, yeah. But I was going to say the 20th time in my life that was really egregious. So I don't think that we have the moral authority, and I think that what we are witnessing is the end of the unipolar moment and the beginning of the bi- or tripolar moment, and it's going to be the BRICS nations and probably the US and NATO, more broadly, and maybe more, maybe a big, even, trilateral split. We'll see. But I think that we are sacrificing every advantage we had on the global scale to continue to police the world in a way that has been very detrimental, not just for the people of the globe, but also for America.
Who do you each believe blew up the Nord Stream pipeline and why?
I think it was probably, I don't know if it's MI5 or MI6, the British CIA under the auspices or direction of the US. I mean, you have Biden, you have Victoria Nuland, you have so many people on record saying, one way or another, we're going to end this pipeline, and then it's ended. I don't think I'm connecting too many dots there.
I think the last story that I read, I don't know if it involved some declassified intel or a leak or something. I think the last story I read was the idea was that it was some kind of people loyal to Ukraine, so Ukrainian nationalists or something, that had been involved in the destruction of the pipeline, but I don't have a strong opinion on it right now.
Okay, next question.
So first, Destiny, I think your Twitch ban is garbage and your Twitter ban was garbage, and I think that everybody in this room probably thinks that you should have free speech. So, so thanks for coming. My question about the Ukrainian conflict, so who's the biggest winner of the US support in Ukraine? The Ukrainians, the US mainstream politicians who launder the money for campaign contributions, or the defense contractors?
I would say Ukraine having their country restored to their 91 borders would be the biggest winner, assuming that Ukraine goes back to their 91 borders. It's a country that has been fucked with by Russia, whether it's through attempted political assassination of leaders, or because I think that happened to, is it Yukashenko? I don't remember. There was a guy who was poisoned once, pre-2014, or the actual military invasions from Russia into Ukraine. I think that Ukrainians would very much like to have their country restored and to have Russia stop bullying them in every way they possibly can.
From what I was told, or what I read rather, the alleged poisoning, he went to, I think it was a UN hospital, and they said they couldn't find any traces of the alleged poison. So I don't know if that's true or not, but there's enough chicanery that happens over in that neck of the woods that I'm on the fence. It's possible for sure. Sorry, that was just a side note.
All right, next question. Right here first.
Understanding if you're going to believe the crazy New York Times belief that it is Ukrainians that blew up the pipeline, would you then support the NATO resolution that says that since Germany is a NATO country and it was attacked by a non-NATO country, that all NATO countries should then attack Ukraine?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So it's just complete nonsense then?
I mean, if somebody in you, I mean, there would be, it depends on who is actually responsible. If there were Ukrainian nationalists that were responsible for the destruction of the pipeline, then those
I could
people
point you to half a dozen people who all say that Seymour Hersh is right when he says that.
No,
so.
I've seen Hersh's pieces. It's not very compelling. What I'm saying is that if Ukrainian nationalists did it, those people should be held responsible. If Zelensky or somebody ordered it, then I think that we should reconsider our position with Ukraine if they are engaging in terrorism in order to further their political goals. But like I said, the outcome that I would support would depend on like actually knowing who was the one that was involved in the destruction of the pipeline or who ultimately ordered it. We know it was Ukraine. It was not Ukraine. Okay.
Clint, do you have a follow-up on that same question?
Sorry, what was the question? It got a little spicy. No, I don't want to go to World War III against Ukraine or Russia. That'd be fucking hilarious, though.
All right.
We're backing them the whole way, and then they do some crazy shit. We're like, now you're in trouble. No, I don't want to do that.
Next question.
Would Russians or Ukrainians be justified in evading military conscription? Destiny, you're concerned. So you're concerned about Ukraine's right to national self-determination. Well, a nation is a collection of individuals. So what about individual self-determination? Thank you.
Ooh, we're essentially talking about like conscription of the draft. Honest to God, like I'm like 51-49. I think a good argument could push me either way. I would say that on one end, if an individual doesn't support the actions that a nation is taking, it seems a little bit crazy that that nation could compel a person to serve in the military to support said actions. So that would be like a strike against conscription. I would say that the type of military action is probably relevant. I think that conscripting people to fight in a foreign war, so like the United States going to Ukraine, probably is a lot different ethically than a nation conscripting you to fight for your own country. So that might be a point against Americans being conscripted, but maybe a point in favor of Ukrainians being conscripted. And then, not to draw the ire of the crowd, but I do support things like states and governments. And I think that as part of like my support for taxation, for instance, would be that as long as you live within the borders of a government, you're being provided with certain assurances, with certain positive and negative freedoms, or you're provided with positive ones, you're hopefully guaranteed negative ones, that as part of your contract, your social contract of getting all of these benefits, you also have a responsibility to, say, pay taxes or at least defend your country in the event of like a military attack through things like conscription. So I probably, like for Ukrainians, I'd lean towards like if you get conscripted, you probably have a military obligation to fight. Fighting foreign wars, I don't think so as much. But like I said, that's like I'm like a 51-49 supporting against. Like I could probably be moved either way with a strong argument. I think conscription is a really tough one. I think for myself, like if I would be conscripted to fight like in Ukraine or like Iraq or some shit, I'm fucking leaving the country. Like, well, I'm out of here. No fucking way. But if fucking Russia or China or some country is, you know, invading the shores of my country, I'm fucking grabbing an AR-15. I'm going west or east as quickly as possible because I'll be killing as many people as are trying to invade my country. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, like I said, I could go either way, but that's a really tough question, I think. Yeah.
I got a very short answer. Conscription is slavery, and I fully oppose it. So you should never be compelled to fight for somebody unless it's of your own volition.
Okay.
That was an easy applause line. Jeez.
Softball. Next question. Over here. Nice Bucky's hat.
If a state was to secede, would you support the state's national sovereignty, or would you support the federal government if they chose to invade?
The state.
I think supporting federalized areas is important. I don't think that people should probably have the right to secede from a given federal body. I think that it leads to a lot of weird conundrums where let's say that we say like, okay, well Mexico is going to secede from the union, or Nebraska is going to secede from the federal government. Like, I don't even know what that looks like. Is the federal government, obligated then to continue providing federal services or money for roads? I mean, we'd say probably not, but now you've got like a landlocked country inside of another country. What if like the city of Omaha or Lincoln decided that they wanted to secede from Nebraska? Now do you have like a country in another country? And like maybe in like a more simple or idealized world, I could see some form of secession being a right granted to some like body of land. But I think that in kind of the, I'll say like in the libertarian-esque or in the idealized version of this, you're like basically like Fred and John are getting over a fight on who like has the line of the yard that's theirs, and then they start seceding their houses from their cities, and you get into like weird international wars happening like across blocks from each other. So yeah, broadly I would oppose it, I would say.
All right, next question.
So this is for Destiny. With us reaching $32 trillion in debt, and for those of us that do not want to pay for another war via forced taxation and being thrown in a cage for if we don't pay, are you willing to take on the brunt of the cost of this war, say $5+ trillion, or however much it costs to fund this war?
I checked my bank account. I do pretty well on YouTube. I don't think I have $5 trillion in there, so I'm not entirely sure. I think that I heard this idea floated once. It would be interesting if the types of policies you voted for carried with them some sort of like taxable burden. So for instance, if you support a politician that supports XYZ policies, you also have to chip in some amount of money to support them. But I think that ultimately speaking, I'm going to go to my very cucked version of democracy that I love so much. The United States is a country with people that disagree with each other adamantly, but at the end of the day, we all kind of have to come together and vote on and pay for and work through things that you might fucking hate that your neighbor supports, So you might hate food stamps, you might like Section 8 housing, you might hate the war in Ukraine, you might like Social Security, whatever, but at the end of the day, we all have to have somehow we have one unified federal system and then 50 individual states that administer these things, and we all have to share that burden. If we really don't want a war in Ukraine, or if we don't want to support these types of financial endeavors, then it's up to us to show up at the ballot box and vote for leaders that will oppose those types of policies. But until then, I think as long as we are members of a state that provides us services and guarantees us certain things, we also have an obligation to pony up whatever the state is demanding of us.
What was the question?
If you
I think that some people should have a higher financial burden to support the war if other people are opposed to it. So like, who would want to support the $5 trillion? Would somebody like me be willing to pay more money to support that war since I'm in favor of it and other people aren't?
Yeah, I mean, graduated income tax based off of how much of a war hawk lunatic you are. Cool. I don't know. I don't agree with progressivism taxation even when it comes to militarism.
Next question, 1 second before we do round twos. Any other first-time questions on the floor in the front?
So, great, mind blank.
You want me to say something?
No, I was gonna say, it seems like a lot of your position, Destiny, is like Russia doesn't have, or you're afraid Russia is gonna expand after they take Ukraine. Is it like, do they have the economic, possibility to, take control of Ukraine, go over to somewhere else, it just doesn't seem like they can. I don't know, maybe it's a dumb question.
I think that in the United States, I think that after Iraq, I think that we had after Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States politically could not support a lot of intense action in the Middle East. There's a reason why our support for Syria wasn't as full-throated as it could have been. There's a reason why we didn't support Iraq as much as we could have, during ISIS or post-ISIS. And I think the reason why was because of how politically unpopular anything basically involving the Middle East became. I think that for Russia to lose in Ukraine, I think sends a signal, ignoring all of the economic pressure and everything and the sanctions or whatever else, I think it leaves an idea in a Russian's mind that like, okay, well, maybe marching across borders and doing things in other countries is not a good idea. Like, I think we could to some extent point to Ukraine and that invasion as coming off of the 2005 to 2008 invasion of Georgia, because that was, it seems to me like that was really successful. They declared 2 breakaway states, they marched an army south, they stole those territories from Georgia, and they maintained some indefinite support for those breakaway territories. I think it was in '92 they did something similar in Moldova as well. Having that string of successes probably emboldens Russia. Having a success in Ukraine, I think, would embolden them as well. So I think that deterring them at all costs not only does the military and the economic harm, I think it also sends a political message where if Russia is thinking about a special military action or mobilization, maybe the people look back and they think of Ukraine and are like, oof, I don't know if that worked too well. If we're going to do this, we would have a really good reason for it.
All right, next question here in the middle. Take a few more, and then we will let both of you give your final 3 to 5 minute statements.
I would say if we look at history, we see that fixed borders are more of a current thing than a historically long-term thing. Borders kind of ebbed and flowed depending on the strength of a nation. Would you say that going in the next 100 years, fixed borders will be more common or less common for both of you?
I think fixed borders will be more common. I think that the state of the world has changed. I think that that's it. The state of the world has changed. I don't think that we're as accepting as all of the instant military conflicts that is having a rewrite of borders happening all over the world as frequently as it was over the past 100 or 200 years versus the next 100 years going forward.
I think we're at a really interesting inflection point, actually, where we now have weaponry that can end humanity. So it makes conflict, particularly between nuclear armed powers, much more rare. But when it happens, all life on Earth ends. Bummer, right? So it's like a building up of tension as opposed to letting these like little intermediate skirmishes that pop off. You're building up. So I'm actually of the opinion that we ought to be pushing for more referendums and more peaceful separations of land masses so that you don't have these wars that then drag in either NATO or Russia or the US. So I personally would like to see a diminution of the state and a peaceful separation whenever possible. I think it's the moral answer and ultimately the most peaceful one.
Real quick, let it go ahead and go ahead there.
I changed my mind, actually. You know what? I think that we should dismantle all nuclear weapons, because honest to God, the more I think about it, the more I think we're going to fucking Skynet ourselves into non-existence. I feel like that AI shit is crazy. I don't know if... maybe we should just hide the nukes just because if that stuff gets too powerful, yeah, we will see humanity wiped out faster than ever before, so...
That's very ironic. We had a question come in that was literally for both of you. What is, from the beginning of this conflict to now, what is one position that you have newly adopted from your opposition, if any at all, during this entire turmoil? Anything that you have listened, heard a different argument on the other side of this issue, and that has made sense to you?
Not from us, but
just in general.
In the beginning, from 2014, I was kind of not caring at all about the Ukrainian stuff. I kind of figured that I'd heard that a lot of people in Crimea were ethnically Russian. I'd heard that a lot of people in Eastern Ukraine were ethnically Russian. If they wanted to invade, if the people that were voting to go back, then I figured, why does it matter if the people there identify as Russian anyway? Is it right for Ukraine to maintain that? But the more that I did research into the history of the Soviet Union, the history of the Russification of places like Ukraine, how things like the Holodomor caused a massive loss of life across a ton of countries, Kazakhstan and Ukraine included, that caused Russia or the former Soviet Union to ship new citizens in and to maintain those ethnic superiority, or not ethnic superiorities, but those ethnic superior numbers, majorities, I should say. I kind of changed my mind on that, and now I'm more in favor of supporting the idea of recognizing that Ukraine has a right to their 91 borders. There was no good reason for Russia to take the country, and I think that that's a right that should be fortified by the rest of the world, especially because I think the saddest thing from a Ukrainian perspective was in 1994, prior to 1994, Ukraine had, I think, one of the largest stockpiles of nuclear weapons in the world, because I think the Soviet Union stored a lot of the nuclear weapons there. And Ukraine signed a memorandum in Budapest, Hungary, and they said, hey, listen, we're going to give up all of our nuclear weapons. We're going to join, we're going to assent to like non-nuclear proliferation status. There's a name for this treaty, but they basically said that we're going to give all our nuclear weapons up, and we just want to be chilling left alone. They're like, okay, cool. And then they get invaded, 10 years later. It's like, well, fuck. What kind of message does that send to the rest of the world? Basically, if you don't have nukes, expect to get your shit pushed in. So, yeah, I definitely was. I kind of not supported Russia, but I didn't care in 2014. And then when the actual invasion happened, I was like, oh, this is kind of weird. And then I did a lot of research, and now I'm pretty strongly on the pro-Ukrainian side.
I need to actually respond to that Budapest memorandum part because, first off, the nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine they didn't have the codes. The Ukrainian government didn't have the codes for them. They were USSR, equipment. So they were also paid pretty significantly to give those up. So it wasn't like it was just, hey, we're giving them up. And then this is the part that I think will probably concern you the most is that it was included in the excuse me, what is it? Budapest Memorandum. Thank you, Budapest. I was going to say Belarus. I'm going to say that in a second. In the memorandum, it says that you're not allowed to invade, alter the borders, or sanction. And in fact, the U.S. government in 2012 sanctioned Belarus, which was a signatory as well to this memorandum. So in response to that, when being questioned as to how the U.S. could do that, they said, well, it was, it's advisory. Like, it's not a legal agreement. This is U.S. policy. So I think that the people that are relying on that are making a mistake, and the Russians see it the same way that the U.S. does. It's a fucking piece of paper. No one actually cares. And then what was the original question? I'm sorry.
Is there anything since the beginning of this conflict that
actually,
you've...
This is actually surprising. I really dismissed the Nazi claims about C-14 and Azov and Right Sector. I just thought it was probably way overblown. I don't think it's that overblown, actually, which I guess wouldn't be my opposition from where I sit today, but like that was the claim that I found most far-fetched. And then after I read and researched more on it, it seemed as if there is a significant issue with Nazism, however you pronounce it, in Ukraine. So that definitely surprised me. And then, I don't know, I had one other thing to say, but I forgot it. So, next question.
All right, we're going to take a couple more questions and then give you guys both 5 minutes for your closing statements. Are there any further questions from the audience? One over here.
Yeah, Destiny, you said it's a scary thought to think of U.S. or NATO troops firing at Russian soldiers, which was good to hear. And considering, I don't know if Ukraine has a chance militarily straight up against Russia, I don't think so, correct me if I'm wrong, but if that's the case, what is the end game? Do we just continually dump billions and billions and support it indefinitely? Like when do we say, what do you see as victory if it keeps dragging on, and when do you say we're out or we stop?
I think it's probably important for the United States and Russia to look for off-ramps. I'm just not entirely sure what that off-ramp would look like right now. If Ukraine is making solid progress, then Ukraine probably wants to continue on. It's kind of weird to off-ramp it right here. But I think that if we get kind of like quagmired down and there's not much progress on either end, we probably don't want to be dumping hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine year after year after year after year. I don't know enough right now to say like resolutely this conflict should be over by 2025 or bust. But yeah, I would say it's probably important to look for like key elements to be like, okay, neither side has made much progress. We're kind of like in this indefinite war zone. Civilian casualties are climbing. There's no real reason to continue this. So yeah.
Just a question for you, because reporting that I've seen was that it was actually 1 month after the invasion that there was a agreed upon, at least in principle, peace between Ukraine and Russia that would have left them with basically autonomous governmental organization over the Donbass region, and then Crimea would stay with Russia. From my vantage point, that seems like the most reasonable path towards peace. Allegedly, it was Boris Johnson at the direction of the State Department that nixed it. This is part of the reason I believe that this is actually more about bleeding the Russians to punish them and to diminish them as a competing power on the national or on the global scale. But that to me seems like the most obvious answer, is particularly given that seems as if the Ukrainians were okay with it. I know that your sticking point is Crimea. if the Ukrainians were okay with it, would you still find that to be problematic?
If the Ukrainians are okay with it, then the Ukrainians are okay with it. It's their war, not ours. We're only helping them. If Ukraine was like, you know, screw it, we don't want Donbass, we don't want Crimea, then fine, that's their country. But my understanding is I don't think they would have ever accepted a peace treaty with the Donbass off the table. I'm trying to remember the quote. I thought that Zelensky was offered, was it either humanitarian or food supplies or something, and I think he was in Kiev, and he said, I don't need first aid, I need more bullets. I don't think that Ukraine was keen to give up either the entire Donbass or any region of it. But if they wanted to, then yeah, I mean, it's their country, it's their choice.
Sorry, just to clarify, it was just essentially like strengthening the federalist model so that the Donbass would have more autonomy, but it would still be part of Ukraine. It was only Crimea that was actually becoming part of Russia, but that's side point. Is there any more questions?
I think this concludes the questions. If you guys want to have 2 minutes, not just about your position, but also reiterate yourself, where these guys can follow you further from this point. It's been a fascinating hour that went by very quickly and was very productive. I thank you both. It's phenomenal. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, I think the United States is who Europe and a lot of the Western world looks to kind of set the standard, or at the very least enforce the standard for what the security status of Europe especially should look like. The United States is not perfect. I'm old enough to know that, and any glance at a history book will obviously show you fault after fault after fault. But we make mistakes like Vietnam, but there's also situations like Korea. South Korea is one of the most prosperous nations in the world in terms of per capita growth. There's been a miraculous growth there, and in Taiwan, and a lot of these places only exist at the behest of U.S. foreign policy. So we make mistakes. I do agree with that, but we can't let some mistakes cloud our judgment for making better decisions in the future. I do think that we have a moral authority to support Ukraine. I think that Ukraine is being unfairly invaded. I don't think that Russia has ever given good justification for their invasion. I think that in '91, the entire world recognized Ukrainian borders, and we should restore them to those borders. I don't think a nuclear holocaust is coming. I think that Russia, although they saber rattle, they are conducting themselves in ways where they are moving weapons in the open. They are following their nuclear doctrine to a T, and I don't think that any actual strategic analysis would show you that it looks like they are keen to use their nuclear weapons at any point in time. So I think that the United States should continue to support Ukraine and support their territorial and sovereignty, and I think more broadly support the security status of Europe and places like Taiwan by showing countries you can invade countries and just take their stuff just because you have nuclear weapons or just because you feel a certain type of way about it. But I recognize that hopefully in the next several months or maybe a year or two, we're looking for like a positive off-ramp in Ukraine so it doesn't end up being Afghanistan 2.0 or Iraq 2.0 or Vietnam 2.0.
It was William Perry was the Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, and he says that the gravest mistake of his tenure was not pushing back harder against NATO's expansion. I take his opinion sincerely. He wrote it. It's like his autobiography. I think that he understands, and he's made it quite clear that he doesn't believe that this war would be happening had NATO not expanded up to Russia's borders. So if Bill Clinton's defense secretary is willing to acknowledge it, I think we, the American people, ought to acknowledge it as well. We put far too much pressure on them, particularly given that we have them outmatched militarily, but they have us outmatched in one capacity, and that is ending the world. That is the only way the Russians can ultimately prevail against NATO and the West. And no one wins if we go that path. That is my gravest concern. That is the reason I accepted this debate. I think that it is a fool's errand, as the great Scott Horton might say, to continue on this path, to risk all of humanity to decide which corrupt government gets to rule over the eastern portion of Ukraine. I could care less, if I'm being totally honest. I could care less. I think that the people of Ukraine should have their say, and unfortunately, they're dying. A lot of them. And it's heartbreaking. And I think that oftentimes the human cost of war gets lost in these discussions. It's more about who's going to be right. I don't view it that way. I grew up in San Diego, California. Most of my friends were Marines. And they came back from all these other fucked up, worthless wars, and their hands were trembling as they held revolvers every night and drank. It's not okay. And we're risking a consistent, persistent war with the biggest nuclear power on Earth aside from us. And I think it was highly avoidable. I think it was highly provoked. And I don't, my moral conscience, just as William Perry feels, I could not sleep at night if I didn't speak out in this moment. Thank you, guys.
Thank both of you very much. If you do not mind, before we depart, please let everyone know your shows, where people can follow you. Just take a moment here to let us all know, because this might be the first time some of us have interacted with both of you.
Yeah, I'm youtube.com/Destiny and Instagram.com/Destiny. My website is destiny.gg.
I didn't even say thank you to him. Thank you so much, man. Absolute pleasure. Appreciate it. Clint Russell, host of Liberty Lockdown, also host of Tower Gang. Don't watch that one. You can follow me on Twitter at LibertyLockPod, and I am in negotiations right now to work with Tim Pool to do a poker show called Poker with the Boys. So if you want to see that, tweet at Tim Pool and tell him to send the fucking contract. Let's make this shit official, yeah? That's it. Thank you, guys.
One more thing. Sorry, I went through your Twitter feed before we did this, and I was expecting you to be a lot more rude than you were. So I would like to say, actually, I do appreciate it that you're, even though we're very, very, very different positions, I really do appreciate you. You're a really good, really good supporter about us. Thank you so much.
Awesome, awesome.
I hope you guys enjoyed that. I certainly did. I haven't got a chance to watch it back myself yet, but I assume I did okay. I think I'm gonna give myself a B-. Yep. I could have done a hell of a lot better. And I hope, more than anything, I just hope I didn't let down Scott Horton and Dave Smith, because, they would have crushed that. For sure, they would have crushed it. But like I said, first time I was up against a dude with a hell of a lot of experience, and I think that, I held my own. And for a first go, I'll take it. But I'm going to get better. You better watch out. I'm going to get better. If you want to support my work, go to libertylockdown.locals.com. I will be doing an episode tomorrow, but I will also be doing an AMA where you get to come in on stream with me over on Locals later this week. That is libertylockdown.locals.com. Sign up to become a supporting member. Support the work that you want to see more of in the world, and I will continue to deliver more of that content. God bless. I'll see you guys soon. Peace.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold. Where did it come from and where did it go?